We at the Center for Political Innovation are an anti-imperialist organization. And we understand that imperialism is not a policy. Imperialism is not when a country does something bad, when a country attacks another country, when a country is mean to another country. Imperialism for us has a real definition. We actually have been saying imperialism slash globalism or globalism slash imperialism. Because if you just say imperialism, people think that you're doing something related to woke and gender studies and white skin privilege, and that's not what we're doing. However, if you just use the word globalism, people think you're using a conspiracy theory, you're advocating some kind of right-wing nationalism. Well, we're doing neither of those things. But if you say imperialism slash globalism or globalism slash imperialism, people kind of get it, which is we're talking about a system where big banks and corporations dominate the world and keep the world poor in order to make themselves rich. And that system was described by Vladimir Lenin, leader of the Bolshevik Revolution. He called it imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. And he wrote about the rise of an international financial oligarchy, the export of capital, banking becoming dominant over industry, the rise of financiers, and the territorial partition of the African continent, of Asia, of South and Central America. This is what Vladimir Lenin called imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, capitalism in its monopolistic stage. But before Vladimir Lenin, you had Henry Charles Carey, the great anti-slavery abolitionist economist. And he wrote in his great pamphlet, A Harmony of Interests, about the English system versus the American system, and how the English system, as he described it, was what the practice of human chattel slavery in the U.S. South was rooted in. It was a system of free trade, dominance of the world with a mighty military, controlling trade routes, occupying tracts of land, underworking the Hindu, and sinking the rest of humanity down to his level. Depopulation, desolation, ignorance, barbarism, and pauperism. That was the British Empire system based on the theories of Malthusianism that wanted to drive down the population. And he contrasted with that the American system, the idea of having a national bank, the idea of expanding and increasing the population and of building up an industrial economy upon the land and increasing the population, increasing living standards, elevating while equalizing the conditions of mankind. And that was another understanding of imperialism. And now, rising in Eurasia and in Russia and in China, there is talk of geopolitics. And they speak of the empires and civilizations of the sea, the Atlanticist world order versus the civilizations of the land, the continental or Eurasian style civilizations, in which the focus is on the land, and how civilizations develop differently based on geography. And the British Empire system, like the Roman Empire system that originated on the Italian peninsula, like American globalism, it's an empire of the sea. This is sea civilization, the notion of having a mighty navy, controlling trade routes, the Viking, barbarian, Roman Empire way of doing things, the role of sea power in history by Alfred Mahan, the empires of the sea that control trade routes, that make all the wealth of the world concentrate into one mighty city and keep people impoverished, versus the civilizations of the land that have to raise productivity and development and have more of a collective consciousness. If you're building a civilization on the land, to connect the different parts of your empire, you must pave roads. And that's why China had the world's first civil service examination, because they were a civilization and an empire on the land. That's why China developed paper money. That's why China had so many great achievements as an empire, even thousands of years ago, because they were building a civilization of the land. And as a people of the land, they had to hold the land together. And you could say the same for the Russian empires that existed, and that there is a fundamental difference between the empires of the sea and the civilizations of the land. There are many different ways that you can look at it. You can talk about Eurasian and civilizations of the land, geopolitics versus civilizations of the sea. You can talk about Lenin and imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, capitalism in its monopolistic stage, the rule of the world by financiers and bankers. You can talk about Henry Charles Carey and the English system versus the idea of an American system of industrialization. You can talk about it any way you want, but the reality of the world is this. The international bankers and global monopolies that rule the world right now, the globalist bankers, the international monopolists, the World Business Forums, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the DuPonts, the Rothschilds, the Mellons, the international cartels of finance that dominate the world, the huge multinational corporations, they sit atop a system that is dying. A system where profits are in command, a system where human life doesn't matter, a system where human beings' only value is their ability to rent themselves out to a boss, and a system that cannot handle the continued technological development resulting from human creativity. And that system, based on the old colonial order, rooted in colonialism, that system is dying across the world. And across the world, nations are breaking free from that system. And people are fighting to be free from that system in the Middle East right now. People are fighting to be free from that system in Africa right now. People are fighting in Latin America to be free from that system. People are fighting in Asia to be free from that system. In every corner of the world, people are fighting to break out of the old colonial order that views mankind as an animal, as a mere financial calculation, and they are struggling to establish their independence so that they can have economic growth. That is what they are fighting for. And all over the world, humanity is fighting to break out of that system, and we are here as the Center for Political Innovation to say that we must join the fight here in America. America must break out of this system. There is no future for America in globalism. There is no future for America in imperialist monopolistic capitalism. There is no future for America in the Zionist world order. There is no future for America in the rule of finance and the old colonial system, and that America must break free, and that the only future that America can have is joining with the people of the world and joining with the independent forces in the world economy and joining with the world on the basis of win-win cooperation, becoming part of the rising multipolar world. America must embrace the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. America must embrace the Eurasian Economic Union. America must embrace the Union of Sahel States. America must embrace the axis of resistance in the Middle East. America must embrace the Bolivarian alternative of Latin America. And that right now, American working families must demand a government of action that fights for working families. Because yes, at one point it was true that average Americans were seeing their living standard go up as a result of imperialism. You could say that in the post-World War II generation, that while our leaders bombed and murdered people in Korea, our living standard went up. While they bombed and murdered people in Vietnam, our living standard went up. While they backed death squads in South and Central America, our living standard went up. But those days are over. There's no room for us in the assembly line. There are no more factories for us. And that home in the suburbs with a white picket fence has been foreclosed. And the roads are crumbling. And the water is not properly purified, and our bridges and our highways are falling apart, and our living standard is going down, and all the imperialists are offering us is opioids and prison and war around the world to defend their dying, outmoded international order. And so we must declare independence from it, just as we declared independence from the British Empire system on July 4th, 1776, just as Abraham Lincoln fought to break us out of the British Empire system and defeat the brutal practice of human chattel slavery. We must reassert once again the drive to grow and expand and have a better life that seems to define in a vague way the American spirit, and break out and build a movement against imperialism and fight to establish an America that is not part of the decaying international financial order. And anything to build an anti-monopoly coalition, to demand a government that invests in people and not the speculative wealth of international bankers, not the fictitious capital on Wall Street, but real physical economy, real growth, and real creativity of human beings, expanding population, expanding life expectancy, expanding the economic opportunities for the next generation. That is what we should demand. And the Center for Political Innovation strives every day to build such a movement. And that is why we are inspired by the great African leader, Ibrahim Traoré. That is why we're inspired by the resistance of the people in Yemen against Israel and the Zionists. That's why we're inspired by the Islamic Republic of Iran and its ability to withstand an all-out onslaught from the biggest and most powerful militaries in the world. And we believe that the American people have a common enemy with the people of the world, and that America can break free from imperialism and be part of the rising new economy in the world, that America can also be free from the American empire. That is what we believe, and that is what we are striving to build each day with our anti-globalist, anti-imperialist, pro-working families, constructive, optimistic, and patriotic movement, the Center for Political Innovation. That's us. Now, if you didn't know all of that, I'm glad you heard it for the first time. But if you did know all of that, tonight I'm going to give you some very, very, very important background, because it may not make sense. Because if you understand politics the way it's been discussed in America for so long, it doesn't make sense. And I, Caleb Maupin, do not make sense. And I don't pretend that I make sense. I have known my whole life that I don't make sense, and that I think about the fact that I'm here in New York City, in Brooklyn, New York, as somebody who's met Russian President Vladimir Putin, as somebody who's had a face-to-face sit-down with Ibrahim Traoré, the deceased president of Iran, as somebody who risked my life on a ship trying to bring medical aid to Yemen, as somebody who has been to Venezuela, as someone who's had a face-to-face chat about economics with the son of the Nicaraguan president, as somebody who's had books translated and published in many languages. I don't make sense. I don't make sense. And I don't make sense in the way we used to understand politics, but I do make sense. And what we're building as a movement may not make sense, but it does make sense if you understand us. Are we leftists? Well, I used to think I was a leftist. That's my political background, but I've evolved and learned a lot. Are we right-wingers? No, we're certainly not advocates of the free market. We're certainly not advocates of any kind of racial or ethnic supremacy, but we also celebrate traditional values, and my faith in Jesus Christ is a huge part of my worldview at this point. So what are we? What are we? How does the Center for Political Innovation make any sense? We're not right. We're not left. We're not backward. We're not forward. We are just a movement that generally is urgently needed in our time. What is the Center for Political Innovation? Where did it come from? And how does it make any sense? Well, I will tell you how it makes sense. I have come to understand that this man is my ancestor. This man is somebody that I am descended from. This is a great, great man in American history. Charles Grandison Finney, and he is my ancestor. Let me tell you a story. I'll tell you a story. My mother, her last name is Finney, and her father was my grandfather. And I knew my grandfather. My grandfather was a very kind man. And my grandfather, he didn't speak very much. He grew up on a farm, quite a large farm in Ohio. He was born around the time of World War I. He fought in the Second World War, but he was a very quiet man because he actually witnessed his own father's death when he was a young boy. His father fell in front of the tractor on the farm and died, and he was a witness to it. And he struggled to speak. That's a very traumatic experience for a small child to see their own father die. He saw his father die in a farming accident, and he had difficulty speaking. But he was very, very intelligent. And he fought in the Second World War, and he went to college on the GI Bill, and he was very high achieving. He was kind of a math expert. And after college in the 1950s, he ended up being a member of the Indiana State Agricultural Board. Right. So that's how high achieving he was. And he was on the agricultural board of the state of Indiana, but it just wasn't for him because he was a quiet guy. His nickname, I knew him by this name. His nickname, his fraternity brothers gave him in college, was Zip. They called him Zip because he was kind of a quiet guy. And so they named him Zip, like, oh, he's so fast because he's so quiet. It was kind of a joke on the fact that he had kind of a very quiet, calm demeanor. He was kind of a taller guy, but tall and quiet. And so they called him Zip as a joke. I knew him as my granddad Zip growing up, and his name was James H. Finney. But we knew him as Granddad Zip. He was a mathematical expert, and he worked at a chemical research facility, and he raised sheep as his hobby. And that family that my mother's family come from, they all have certain attributes about them. One, they all have long, bony fingers, right? I've got these long, bony fingers. When I was a kid, people always said to me, Caleb, I bet you're going to become a great piano player. You got the long, bony fingers of a piano player. Well, I took piano lessons. I was never very good at the piano, but, my mother's family, they all have long, bony fingers. The other thing about my mother's family is they're very, very religious. My mother's family, they don't drink. Right? My mother was brought up to believe one should never drink alcohol. They don't drink, and they're very religious. And when my grandfather, James H. Finney, was a kid, they weren't allowed to play with face cards. He learned to play cards with a special game that they had back then called Rook, because he wasn't allowed to have any cards with faces on them, because the Bible says, thou shalt not make any graven images. And they're very, very religious, the Finney family that I grew up in. And my grandfather's mother graduated from Oberlin College, which is an important college in Ohio. It's now quite a liberal college, and it was quite a liberal college always. But there was a time in American history where being a radical and being a liberal and being a religious fanatic walked hand in hand. And that's because Oberlin College was started by this man, Charles G. Finney. And I am a descendant of Charles G. Finney. I don't know exactly how I am a descendant of Charles G. Finney, but I do know that my grandfather, his mother, graduated from Oberlin College. I do know that my mother's last name and her whole family are named Finney. I do know that that we all have long, bony fingers, and that my mother's family is very, very religious. I do know that Oberlin College was started by Charles G. Finney, and that my great-grandmother was one of the first women to graduate from Oberlin College, and she got into it because she had a family connection with the people who started it. And one way or another, I am descended from Charles G. Finney. He is one of my ancestors in one roundabout way or other. My family is from Ohio, and the Finney family came to Ohio because of the great Charles Grandison Finney. But Charles Grandison Finney didn't start out in Ohio. My ancestor, Charles G. Finney, started out in New York, and he was a pastor in New York City, and he was a pastor at Chatham Chapel. And they changed it to Chatham Garden Theater. It's right near Wall Street in the financial district. That's the church that he started preaching in. And he preached on Wall Street in that area, and he was a Presbyterian minister at this church. At Chatham Garden Theater is where he had his church services, right near the financial district there in New York City. But he didn't last long. It was the 1800s, and he was preaching in New York City, and he had a little bit of a problem, because what is he right next to? Wall Street. He's right next to Wall Street. And as a pastor, as a Presbyterian pastor in New York City in the 1800s, in the early 1800s, being right next to Wall Street, he had a little bit of a problem, which is that he was morally opposed to slavery. He said this is an actual quote from my ancestor, Charles G. Finney. Slavery is the greatest sin in this nation. And while it exists, the church can never enjoy the full blessing of God. Now, that seems like common sense, right? Slavery is wrong. We can all agree on that. But in 1800, in New York City, right next to Wall Street, them was fighting words, because where did Wall Street get its money from? Before the New York Stock Exchange was created, Wall Street was an insurance place. It was an insurance district, a network of insurance cartels and corporations right next to the harbor. They insured exports, people that were taking products from America and shipping them across the Atlantic Ocean to Britain, got insurance for their ships on Wall Street. And what were they shipping across America? Cotton, tobacco, indigo, Yes, slave-related enterprises. Wall Street, New York, was a stronghold of pro-slavery sentiment in the North. In the North, they did not practice slavery, but Wall Street, New York, was a stronghold of slavery sentiment. And the Democrat Party, the Tammany Hall Democrat Party machine, was pro-slavery and pro-Confederate, even during the Second World War. And Charles G. Finney, with his church just blocks up from Wall Street, didn't do what was trendy, and he didn't do what was popular, and he preached that slavery was inconsistent with the Bible and inconsistent with Christian teachings. This is my ancestor. I am proud, absolutely proud, to be descended from this great man. And he preached in opposition to slavery, and he refused to give communion in his church to anyone who was involved in the practice of slavery. He said it was the greatest sin in this nation. And they ran him out of New York City, and they attacked him on the street, and they threatened him, and he had to flee to Rochester, New York, because they did not want him in the city. And one of his greatest enemies was the Freemasons. He had been a Freemason as a young man, but as he saw that the Freemasons were involved with the British Empire, and the Freemasons defended the practice of chattel slavery, and one of the leaders of the Freemasons, Albert Pike, went on to become a leader of the Confederacy. He renounced Masonry, and he got involved in anti-Masonic activism because he saw that Masonry was expounding the ideals of the British Empire and justifying slavery. And so Charles G. Finney, my ancestor, made an enemy out of the Masons. He did not like the Freemasons. He thought they were not Christian. He thought they were involved with the British Empire, and he thought they were involved in slavery. So they ran him out of New York City. And he moved to upstate New York. And in upstate New York, he began preaching. He began preaching in upstate New York, and he began the practice of setting up tents outside. Instead of preaching indoors, he would set up a tent by the river. And the practice of tent revival preaching in America was invented by my ancestor, Charles G. Finney. You can look this up. And he began baptizing people in the river in Rochester, New York, and other places, urging them to repent from the practice of slavery and preaching that slavery was an abomination to America. And eventually he moved his congregation out to Ohio and started Oberlin College. And Charles G. Finney was the founder of the Second Great Awakening, a vast religious movement in America that opposed the practice of slavery. This is in my blood. This is my ancestry. I told you about my grandfather. I told you about my grandfather, and I told you about this. This is my heritage. These are my people. And he was opposed to the practice of slavery, and he developed all kinds of methods of agitation. And what was really going on during these years, from the 1800s all the way up to the 1850s, you had the Second Great Awakening in America. And what was happening was there was a division within the ruling class. There was a division within the ruling class. The slaveholders, their power in the government was overrepresented because the U.S. Constitution said that a slave is 3/5 of a human being. And the slave states had their electoral votes expanded. They dominated the Supreme Court, and they dominated the political system. And the Southern plantation owners, who were in league with the British Empire, and they had their Freemason secret society and Albert Pike, they had taken control of the American government. But there was a rising layer of industrialists, factory owners who didn't believe in slavery. There was a labor movement in America that didn't believe in slavery. And as a result, there was a division in the ruling class. This is called Bonapartism. One faction of the ruling class, the pro-slavery faction of the ruling class, had seized control of the American government. But the free soilers and the small farmers, they did not want slavery to control the American government. The industrialists did not want that. The factory owners and the labor movement, the labor unions didn't want it. And so they had to build a mass movement of the people to push back against the rival faction in the ruling class. This is how revolutions happen. When the ruling class begin fighting among themselves and start bringing people into politics, That's how people get active. And the ruling class of the North, the industrialists, began funding people like my great ancestor, Charles G. Finney, to start preaching and building a mass movement, a mass religious movement to oppose slavery. And that's what the Second Great Awakening in American history was. The industrialists and the factory owners, they started funding this movement that was opposing slavery to push back against the power of the Southern plantation owners. A division within the ruling class created an opening for the people. And the Second Great Awakening, what was the song, the anthem of the Second Great Awakening that people knew? Well, the anthem, the most famous song that we know that comes from the Second Great Awakening is the song Amazing Grace, right? And what's that song about? It was a slave exporter, a slave trader who went to Africa, and he had a whole bunch of people he was taking back to America to be slaves. And then a storm came upon the ship, and he feared for his life, and he heard the voice of God telling him, you must turn that boat around. You must repent from the practice of slavery. So John Newton, the slave trader, turned the ship around and brought the African people back to their homeland and repented from the practice of slavery and wrote this song, Amazing Grace, which is considered to be the most American revival hymn. And that story was told because what my ancestor, Charles G. Finney, was preaching at those tents by the river in Rochester, New York, and eventually out in Ohio, where my family's from, what he was preaching was that our nation must repent from the practice of slavery, that if we continue to be part of this British Empire system of slavery, we're going to lose our homeland, and that we've got to turn the ship around. America has got to turn around from the practice of slavery. That's what he was preaching. And that's what the Second Great Awakening was about. It was about the Christian theme of repentance. However, it was repentance for the whole nation. We must oppose the practice of slavery. We must oppose it, and we've got to turn this around, and we've got to fight back against the slave owner, plantation owning bureaucracy and the British Empire that have seized the grip of our country. And actually, it's not just the song Amazing Grace that comes out of the Second Great Awakening. The Battle Hymn of the Republic. Well, the Battle Hymn of the Republic, mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. Originally, that was John Brown's body. John Brown's body. That was the abolitionist John Brown who led the heroic raid on Harper's Ferry. But before it was that, it was a song that Charles G. Finney would sing at his tent revivals. In order to get people to come to his tent revivals, he would send the choir of his church to go through a town to get people to come, and they would sing, "Hey, brother, will you meet us?" Saying basically a song asking people, are you going to go to heaven when you die? Hey, brother, will you meet us? This was the song that my ancestor, Charles G. Finney, would send choirs to sing when he would come to a town with his anti-slavery religious movement. He would come to a town, he would send the choir to go up and down the streets of the town singing, "Hey, brothers, will you meet us?" to gather people to come to his tent revival services. This is the original song that eventually brought us John Brown's body, that eventually brought us the Battle Hymn of the Republic.
Say, brothers, will you meet us? Say, brothers, will you meet us? Say, brothers, will you meet us on Canaan's happy shore? Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Forever, evermore. By the grace of God we'll meet you. By the grace of God we'll meet you. By the grace of God we'll meet you where parting is no more. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Forever, evermore.
Yes, my ancestor, Charles G. Finney, he invented a practice at his tent revival services. He would set up in the front row a bench in the front row, and he would say, if there's anyone who is thinking of converting to Christianity or anyone who is doubting their faith, sit on this bench. It was called the anxious bench. And he would preach his sermons to the people on the bench, right? And he would preach at them and try to convince them to accept the gospel and to oppose slavery and to repent from any involvement they had in slavery. And the audience that would be there would be cheering for them, would be cheering for the people sitting on the anxious bench. And one by one, these people on the anxious bench would get up and accept the gospel and accept Jesus and repent from the practice of slavery. And the whole audience would be cheering for them. This was a technique that he used called the anxious bench that he invented as part of his tent revival preaching. And it was something that he did that was very, very amazing. And that's my ancestor, Charles G. Finney. And he is considered one of the most important preachers in American history, the founder of Oberlin College, a pioneer of the abolitionist movement. And that's my mother's family. And while we're talking about my mother's family, I'm going to talk about another relative. I told you about my grandfather, whose last name was Finney, who wasn't allowed to play with playing cards or, when he was a kid, and had long bony fingers and, wasn't allowed to drink alcohol, and raised my mother to believe you should never drink one drop of alcohol because they were that kind of religious folks. That's my background. But I want to talk about another member of that side of my family. I want to talk about my uncle. All right. I had an uncle that was a very, very neat guy. I really wish that there were more about him on the internet, but this is his obituary from the Chicago Tribune. It's in the chat. He died when I was 11 years old in 1999. His name was James Finney, but when he got married, his wife, her last name was Pot, so he hyphenated his name. He became James Finney Pot. Right? And that was my mom's older brother. And he was a theater professor in Chicago. And he was a dynamic individual in so many ways, right? I mean, he had this heritage, right? I mean, he was descended from greatness. And, my mother's side of the family are very high achieving people, but he was a theater professor. He was a theater professor, and he was 45 years old. He had Marfan's syndrome, which is a heart condition that he had, a genetic heart condition. And he died at the age of 45. He had a heart attack and died. But before that, he had been in a number of Hollywood movies. He was in the movie A Bridge Too Far. He had a minor role in that film. He had a minor role in a number of films. And he also had, toured the world on a recumbent bicycle. He actually lived in Burkina Faso for a while. And he was part of a special program in the 1990s teaching theater in Burkina Faso. So it's talk about, weird parallels of history. He actually taught theater for a couple months in the African nation of Burkina Faso. That is now where the great African leader Ibrahim Traoré is. And he died when I was 9 years old, or I was 11 years old. He was my hero when I was a kid. I grew up in a rural area, in a small rural area, because, my mother's family, they were farmers, Irish Americans, but rural Irish American Protestants, fanatical Irish American Protestants. They lived in a rural area in Ohio. From Evanston. That's where he died. He lived in Evanston when he died. He was my hero. And I remember going to visit him, when I was a kid, and seeing the big city of Chicago. And meeting, his friends that were film directors and screenwriters and, theater people. And he just breathed life. I wanted to be like him when I was a kid. I didn't want to be like the people in my small town. I wanted to be like my uncle. My uncle was my hero. He was my hero. He died, and I was very saddened by his death. And it was at my uncle's funeral that I first heard on the bagpipes this song. Because my uncle was very proud of his Scotch Irish ancestry, the fact that he was of Irish and Scottish descent, and he had learned to play the bagpipes. He was very proud to be a bagpiper. You know, and this is the song that I remember the bagpiper performed at my grandfather's funeral. It's called the Skyboat Song.
Speed, bonny boat, like a bird on the wing, onward the sailors cry. Carry the lad that's born to be king, over the sea to sky. Though the waves leap, soft shall you sleep, the ocean's a royal bed. Rocked in the deep, Flora will keep watch by your weary head. Speed, bonny boat, like a bird on the wing, onward the sailors cry. Carry the lad that's born to be king, over the sea to sky. Burned are our homes, exile and death scatter the loyal men. Yet ere the sword cool in its sheath, Charlie will come again. Speed, bonny boat, like a bird on the wing, onward the sailors cry. Carry the lad that's born to be king, over the sea to sky. Like a bird on the wing, onward the sailors cry. Carry the lad that's born to be king, over the sea to sky. Over the sea to sky.
Now, that's one of the most patriotic songs in Scotland. And what is it about, this song that I first heard at my grandfather's, at my uncle's funeral, right? He had died at the age of 45, and the whole family had gathered there. And I remember, you know, sitting there in the front row as a family member. There were about 300 people at the funeral. He was quite a popular guy. And watching, you know, my grandparents and my mom and her sister and all of them walk in behind this bagpiper loudly playing. What was that about, right? Well, that song, I later learned, it's about this guy. It's about this historical figure, right? Bonnie Prince Charlie. Hold on, let me pull up the image. Yeah, let me pull up the image here. It's about Bonnie Prince Charlie, Charles Edward Stuart, who was the leader of the Jacobite uprising in Scotland. So in Scotland, as capitalism was expanding into the Scottish Highlands, many of the Scottish Highlanders were still Roman Catholic. They still practiced the Roman Catholic faith. And the capitalist economy of Britain was emerging, and Glasgow, Scotland, became kind of a stronghold of capitalism. But you still had feudalism in the Scottish Highlands. And so basically to resist the clearing of the commons and the genocide, the primitive accumulation, the throwing all the peasants off their land, and the impoverishment that came with the rise of the free market, the Scottish Highlanders rose up and rallied around Charles Edward Stuart, to defend their homes. They didn't want to get kicked off their land. They didn't want to become homeless, and they didn't want their land to be privatized. So they rallied around Charles Edward Stuart, who claimed he had the right to be king and was a Roman Catholic from France. And Charles Edward Stuart showed up on a boat, and he came to Scotland on a boat, and he said, "We're going to fight off the English, and well, we're going to fight to put me on the throne of all of Britain, and we're going to keep feudalism intact. We're not going to have the clearing of the commons. We're not going to have the clearing of the commons." And we're gonna fight to defend our homes and our land. And they rallied around Bonnie Prince Charles, and Bonnie Prince Charles became this iconic figure. And he led the Scottish people to have a revolt against the English, and to demand that they put Charles Edward Stuart, a Roman Catholic, on the throne for all of Britain. And it was the Jacobite uprising, and it was a big civil war on the island of Britain. And they lost. And the reason that song is called the Skye Boat Song is because he fled to the Isle of Skye. Skye is an island. In order to get away from the British or from the English, he fled to the Isle of Skye. And he became this mythical figure that the Scottish people rallied around. And there's a lot about him. If you ever heard "My Bonnie lies over the ocean, my Bonnie lies over the sea," that song is about Bonnie Prince Charlie, because they believed that he would come again, right? The last verse of that song is, "Burned are our homes, exiled in death, scattered the loyal men. But ere our sword sits in its sheath, Charlie will come again." He was the once and future king. It's almost like King Arthur. He was going to come again. And they believed that he would come again, that he would return. And they would lead the Scots once again to rise up against the Glasgow capitalist system. And that after the defeat of Bonnie Prince Charlie, and after he was forced to flee to the Isle of Skye and then go back to France, the Scottish people were subjected to genocide. They had their own language, Gaelic. And their language was beaten out of them. They would take the kids away from their parents, a lot like what they did to Native Americans later. They took the kids away from their parents because they didn't want the kids to grow up speaking Gaelic. They didn't want the kids to grow up to be Roman Catholic. And they took the kids away from their parents, and they executed people for wearing traditional Scottish clothing, and they committed a genocide against the Highlanders. And it was other Scottish folks who were involved in it. In Glasgow, right? Glasgow was a part of Scotland that was embracing the free market and embracing free trade. Adam Smith was largely in Glasgow, and Adam Smith is one of the ideologues of capitalism, right? If you ever study economics, you read The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. Adam Smith was a Scotsman who hated his own people. And he was trying to argue that his own people were backward and barbaric. And one of the phrases that he uses is the civilizing influence of commerce. He was saying, my people, the Scots, are a bunch of barbarians. And at the same time, they were exterminating the Scottish Highlanders, beating the language out of their kids, taking the children from their parents, executing people for practicing their religion of Catholicism or wearing a kilt or whatever. At the same time they were doing that, Adam Smith was writing his manifestos about the civilizing influence of commerce and free trade, right? And after Bonnie Prince Charlie died, they argued that he would still come again, that spiritually he would come again in spirit, right? And that Scottish nationalism emerged after the death of Bonnie Prince Charlie. It's very interesting because Bonnie Prince Charlie was not a Scottish nationalist. He wanted to rule all of Britain. He just wanted to rule it as a Catholic monarch. But the Scottish people that were being genocided turned him into a mythical figure, kind of a mythical savior that they would rally around. And eventually the rise of Scottish nationalism that came later was inspired largely by the myth of the legend of Bonnie Prince Charlie. It's rather fascinating. But what this really points to is that Glasgow is a port city. Right? Glasgow, the center of free trade where Adam Smith was part of the British Empire system, right? Glasgow is by the ocean. It's a port. And like London, it's part of a sea-based empire. It's part of a sea-based free trade Atlanticist system that the British Empire was creating. And the highlands are landlocked areas, right? Those are mountainous, landlocked people. And this was the civilization of the land battling the civilization of the sea. This was, as the British Empire system that started in London, expanded into Glasgow, and eventually expanded into the Americas, and eventually expanded with its colonization, the people of the land, the Highlanders, the people of the land, were refusing to accept it. And they were rallying in resistance to fight the Empire of the Sea. They were fighting against the emergence of the British Empire system. They were fighting against imperialism, right? This satanic system that sees human beings simply as a mechanism to make profit, that wants to destroy everything sacred, that doesn't believe right and wrong exists, that upholds the individual above all else and individual self-gain, that views humanity as a burden or a herd of animals, that sees mankind as no different than a flock of sheep and would like to reduce us all to living biologically. That satanic order was emerging. And the Scottish people were fighting against it. And they rallied around Bonnie Prince Charlie. And that this points to a reality. And this is a reality that you will see all over the world. You saw this in ancient Rome with Spartacus. You saw this all over the planet. You'll see this right up until today. And that it points to a historic reality, which is that when the civilizations of the land, when the peoples of the land are besieged by the empires of the sea, when the Roman Empire has conquered a territory, right, then the people of the land from among them and from among the soil, really from the soil of the land, will emerge messianic figures who will rally the people to fight and defend their homelands and assert their humanity against the barbaric empires of the sea. Land messiahs, land figures, land saviors, people of the land fighting back will emerge. That's what the Houthis are. The Houthis are from the mountains of Yemen, and they are people of the land fighting back against the free trade British Empire system and its Zionist creation. They are people of the land, people of the mountains, with a religion that they have practiced for thousands of years, fighting to defend their land from the empire of the sea. That's who the Houthis, Ansar Allah, are. And that's who Ibrahim Traoré is. He is a man of the land. This is the people of Burkina Faso fighting against the French imperialists, fighting against the civilizations of the sea, the people of the land fighting back. And from the soil, from the land, emerges messianic figures who fight back against the empires of the sea. And this is just a historic law that when the empires of the sea begin to overtake and besiege the civilizations of the land, from the land itself will become, you will see from the soil of the land, messianic figures who rise up from the soil to defeat the empires of the sea, to repel the imperialists and the colonizers. From the soil arises the messianic figures that fight for humanity's will to live and fight against the destructive evil of the empires of the sea. And this, we can talk, and we're going to talk a lot about Marxism and economics tonight, but we will start with the book of Genesis. Right? The book of Genesis says, "Then the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and a man became a living soul." Now, what in the world does that mean? What in the world does that mean? Humans come from dust. Humans come from soil. Humans come from dirt. What does this mean? What does this mean? That human beings come from dust. And this is reiterated in the Bible, in Genesis as well. It says, "For dust you are, and to dust you shall return." What in the world is this about? It points to the fact that human beings have two sides. On the one hand, we are matter. We are physical matter, right? Just like a tree, just like a slab of wood, just like a stone, just like a rock. We are material. But when we were created, we took on a spiritual existence and breathed nostril. It says The Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul, meaning that we are not simply matter. We have a spiritual existence, but for dust you are and dust you shall return. Our physical existence will vanish, will go away. And the only thing eternal about mankind is our spiritual existence. This is really heavy stuff, right? And that when I say that from the soil emerges a messianic figure, a civilization of the land fighting back, I'm talking about the fact that from the material, from the land, from the dust, emerges forces asserting humanity. Because that is what the empires of the sea essentially are doing. They're holding back development. They want human beings not to take on a human existence. They want human beings to live only biologically. That's a concept in CPI we talk about a lot, living biologically. If you want to talk about life, what is the meaning of life? That's a big philosophical question. But in the biological sense, many things are alive. Trees are alive. The weeds in your garden are alive. Rats and mice are alive. Cats and dogs are alive, but they're not alive in the same way that humans are. They have a biological life. They live biologically in the biological sense, but they're not living in the spiritual sense. They're not really human. They don't have a living soul, right? They have dust. They are matter, and that matter takes on some kind of material process that biology defines as being alive, but they do not have a living soul. But human beings, unlike any other species, are the only species that have a living soul. And you say, hey, Caleb, how do we know they have a living soul? Well, we'll put the Bible aside and we'll go to Friedrich Engels. Friedrich Engels said all other animals merely use their environment. Man, on the other hand, forces the environment to serve him. Human beings master their environment and force the environment to serve them. All other species, they interact with the environment, but human beings take the world around them and innovate. They reinvent their relationship with nature. They can take nature and say, all right, we're going to change this around. We're going to turn this wood into fire. We are going to take this coal and turn it into steel, right? We are going to develop electrification systems. Human beings are the only species that is capable of rapidly expanding its population, rapidly increasing its life expectancy. No other species has done what human beings have done. And this is the missing puzzle, the clue, the answer to the puzzle of human history. What is human history all about? Well, this is something that Marx developed. He called it historical materialism. Understanding that human beings are constantly having technological breakthroughs and advances and reinventing their relationship with nature in order to reach a higher mode of production. That for most of human history, we were hunters and gatherers. But eventually we got so good at hunting and gathering, we had to start developing agriculture, growing crops, and having animals be domesticated, and having, animals as growing animals for the purpose of eating them and food, etc. And that domesticating animals and that growing crops was a new mode of production. And that out of hunter-gatherer civilization came the Asiatic mode of production. Out of the Asiatic mode of production came slavery. Out of slavery came feudalism. Out of feudalism came capitalism. That is the understanding that human beings are constantly reinventing our relationship with nature. And as we reinvent our relationship with nature, society changes. First, there's a technological revolution that invents a new way of interacting with our environment. A new technology is invented. And then that new technology creates a new class. A technological revolution leads to a social revolution. A new class comes into existence because of this new technology. A new social class is created. And then that new social class that is created seizes power and creates a new form of government. And so you have a political revolution where that new class comes into being. This is what Marx called historical materialism, that human beings, as we reinvent our relationship with nature, we rise to a higher mode of production and we reinvent government and the nature of society in the process. This is the nature of humanity. Human beings as the toolmaker species, as the species with a living soul that has the ability to reinvent its relationship with nature, human beings are constantly striving to a higher plane. We have creativity. We have a living soul. This is what it means to be a human being. And the problem that even Marx talked about with capitalism was not that it's simply unfair. Some people have more money than everybody else. That's unfair. Okay. It was not simply that some people sell their labor power and other people own the factories and sell commodities. Okay, that's part of it. But the real problem with the capitalist mode of production was that the more creative human beings become, the more efficient we get, the better that we master and reinvent our relationship with nature, the more human technology advances, the more unstable and impoverished people get. This is the only system in history where people are homeless because there are too many houses. This is the only system in history where people are hungry, not because there's a shortage of food, but because there is too much food. Capitalism has created a situation where the more efficient production gets, the more unstable the economy becomes. People become homeless because there are too many houses. People become hungry because there is too much food. There is abundance created by poverty. Poverty creates abundance, artificial scarcity. Poverty amid plenty. That's the problem that Marx talked about. And none of the socialists and communists these days ever talk about that. You know, they always talk about, the workers in the factories, they make the shoes and they don't get to own the shoes that they make in the factory, see? And the capitalist owns the factory and he has money. They never talk about this. Why don't they ever talk about this? Poverty amid plenty, poverty created by abundance. Why do they never speak of this? They'll talk about income inequality, a phrase Marx never used. They'll talk about employers versus employees, again, something that Marx talked about, but it's not the essence. Why do none of them talk about poverty amid plenty? Why do none of them talk about it? That's what you read the Communist Manifesto. He talks about a problem that would have been an absurdity in epochs of the past. Poverty amid plenty, the problem of overproduction. Why don't they talk about it? Well, I'm going to tell you. This is going to be a long stream. We're going to talk about a lot tonight. But before we get there, let's talk about this problem of poverty created by abundance. I have to show this video. This is the video where I break it all down. This is why AI is causing an economic crisis, right? And you have to understand this. I have to show you this video again because you have to understand what's going on. Because if you don't understand this, you don't get it. The reason that our economy is breaking down right now, and it doesn't make any sense. We should be living in a world of vast abundance, but we live in an irrational economic system, and I'll break it down here.
Explain what needs to be explained, what used to be considered Marxism 101, about why it is that our Western capitalist economy is crashing and burning. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to do some math. And I hate math. You know why I hate math? Because I grew up in America. I went to public school in the United States of America, so I am going to, at risk of embarrassing myself, because math was never my best subject, I am going to do some mathematics here on the board for you to explain the problem.
I very much enjoyed Caleb's speech.
So if you are creating a product, right, if you're a factory owner, you're making a product, you are going to need the material through which that product is made, the manufacturing materials. So that'll be A.
The simple equation you put forward to explain the crisis of overproduction and the falling rate of profit.
And you're probably going to need to transport the product to where it's sold. That's B.
It broke down where your money goes.
You're also going to have to pay your labor costs. Labor costs are represented by C.
Explanations of those concepts that people are able to understand.
Then when consumers purchase the product, they're going to pay a final price. And that final price is D. However, there's a problem with that.
I like the fact that he framed it that way to make it very clear.
Which is that the capitalist can't change how much A costs. He can't change how much B costs. So the profit of the capitalist can only be extracted from the value put into it by the worker. And this is the basis of Marxism, the understanding of surplus value.
I've never seen it explained so simply anywhere. I've never been able to explain it that simply.
So C, the labor value, is divided. You have C1, which is what the worker actually gets paid, And then you have C2, which is the profit that the capitalist makes. And it all adds up to D, which is the final cost of the product. Now, the way people in the United States who talk about Marxism generally talk about this is they say, well, this is unfair. They say the worker is not getting paid the full value of his labor. But they're missing one of the most important points, which is not just that it's unfair and then people argue, well, what about the employer? He put up the money, doesn't he deserve to be? That's all a distraction. Because the important thing to understand is this. C1 is always going to be less than D. The wages paid out to the worker are never enough to buy back the product that he produces. There is always more products created than there are wages paid out to the worker. And this is the built-in problem of capitalism, the problem of overproduction. And it is always there in the capitalist economy. It never goes away. And they have invented all kinds of crazy mechanisms to try and deal with the problem of overproduction. Part of the reason that the US government has purchased billions and billions of dollars worth of cheese only to bury it in a cave in Springfield, Missouri, is to deal with this problem. It is an ongoing present problem, and it's a problem acknowledged by most capitalist economists. John Maynard Keynes said the problem was underconsumption rather than overproduction, but he was pointing to the same problem. The military-industrial complex in the United States is an effort to deal with this problem, to keep spending going. There's all kinds of mechanisms that they've invented to try and resolve this problem, but it gets worse. What is the capitalist always trying to do? He wants to maximize the amount of profit he makes. And one of the main ways they do that is with what's called labor-saving technology. Get rid of workers and replace workers with machines. As they eliminate workers from the process of production, as there's fewer and fewer workers involved, as machines take the place of workers, the role of C in production decreases. There's a little bit of a problem with that. As C goes down, C2 also goes down, right? As C decreases, C2 also decreases. And as the role of the worker in production is reduced, the rate of profit that the capitalist makes goes down. And this is called the tendency of the falling rate of profit. Only human labor creates value. And this is something that Adam Smith acknowledged. This is something some of the popes even acknowledge. Human labor creates all value. And so when you reduce the role of human labor in production, the amount of value created decreases, and the ability of the capitalist to extract surplus value also decreases. So this causes the capitalist to have to churn out even more products because he's making less and less of a profit on the overall product. He's making less and less of a percentage, so he has to churn them out. So this problem of the worker never being able to buy back what he produces and more products being created than are necessary, this problem becomes exacerbated. And this points to what is understood to be the deeply irrational nature of the capitalist system.
Yeah. And that is the issue. And that ultimately, the only solution to this is you need to centralize the means of production. The banks, factories, and industries have to be under the control of a state that is working in the interests of all society. You can't have profits in command, right? You need society to rationally organize the means of production, because if profit is in command, poverty amid plenty will persist. And as technology increases, people will get poorer and you're going to have continued economic crises. But if the banks and the factories and the industries are centrally planned and operated in the interest of all of society, and you take control of the natural resources, and you take control of the financial system and the banks, and you have 5-year economic plans and organize the economy, you can overcome this problem. However, as long as profits are in command, this problem of overproduction and the tendency of the falling rate of profit, poverty created by abundance, is going to persist. That's the problem. But why is it that socialists don't talk about that? Why is it that, even though this is exactly in the word of Marx and the text of Marx, you can find this, why don't they ever talk about this? Well, there's a process that's been going on for the past several hundred years, because when it really gets down to it, there were two sides of Karl Marx. On the one hand, Karl Marx saw what he called the anarchy of production, the chaos of the market, the irrationality of a system that puts profits over people, that leads to, poverty amid plenty. And so he was striving to create order and stability. On the other hand, Karl Marx took with him the spirit of the age, right? That the communist movement comes out of the 1848 revolutions, the spring of nations that swept throughout Europe, that were a rebellion against the tradition of feudalism and a demand for liberty, equality, fraternity. And that on one side of Marx wanted chaos and instability to tear down all oppressors and all kings, right? Ruthless criticism of all that's in existence. On the other hand, Marx wanted order. Marx had two sides to him, and he had two contradictory aspects. Part of him wanted chaos and instability and constant rebellion, and part of him wanted total order and rationality. And that this is just part of who Marx was based on his historical circumstances. And that his philosophy of dialectical materialism was about celebrating conflict and rebellion and negating any notion of spirituality, because he viewed feudalism as the system that everyone was struggling against, as a system in which there is no conflict, right? Everyone's born into their place. Everything is perfectly ordered, and in which that perfect order is justified in the name of spirituality. And Marx was saying there is no spirituality. There is only material, and conflict is what it's all about. We should struggle and rebel and conflict. Well, that was what you could call an overcorrection. Yes, in feudalism, it was wrong that everyone was told that they had one place and they could not question authority, and they were born into it because of their place. And it was wrong. That was justified in the name of God and religion. And so, in order to combat that system, he negated all religion and he embraced conflict as the very nature of reality. Well, conflict is a big part of reality, but it's not the very nature. And spiritual aspects are a big part of mankind. Mankind does indeed have a spiritual aspect to his existence. So because of that, Marx was a bit of an overcorrection. And that when Marxism as a movement came into existence, it began, even from its inception, it served a dual purpose. On the one hand, it became a struggle of the worker to demand economic justice. On the other hand, it became a mechanism through which the British, you got to remember the British Empire could sow unrest on the European mainland, right? In which they could assert themselves. The British very much wanted the French society to be full of turmoil, the German society to be full of turmoil, Italy to be full of turmoil, so that they could dominate and become the top dog imperialist. And it's clear that as the socialist movement proliferated in the 1800s, in the late 1800s, and the early 1900s, it was heavily infiltrated from all sides. The German secret police infiltrated it, the British, the French. It was infiltrated by intelligence agencies, right? As the ruling class were fighting among themselves in Europe and in America, they began using radical organizations as counter gangs through which to assert their interests. And when World War I broke out, the Marxist movement became bankrupt, because the Marxist movement was supposed to be the movement of the working class against the capitalists. But when the capitalists of Britain and the capitalists of France and Germany, capitalists of Italy, the capitalists of America decided to go to war over who got to colonize Africa, and they marched 20 million working people to their deaths in a war over colonial power and colonial rights, a war for colonialism, a battle among the colonizers. 20 million workers were sent to their deaths, and all the socialists supported it. And if you read Lenin and his criticism of the Second International, he says, look, this war would never have happened without socialists. If it wasn't for the bankrupt leaders of social democracy in Germany, of the Labour Party in Britain, of the French socialist groups, if it wasn't for the sellout corrupt leaders in Austria and Belgium, this war would never have taken place. The sellout social imperialist leaders, they had developed a socialism that was really just a mechanism for the imperialists to utilize. That instead of fighting to overthrow imperialism, in a lot of ways, they'd been fighting to make imperialism work better. In Germany, the Social Democrats had fought for public education. They had demanded the right of every kid to go to school and learn how to read. And the German government said, okay, we'll give you public education. And in school, all the kids are going to learn how to march in perfect formation. And in Germany, the Social Democrats had fought to create a national healthcare service. And the German government had said, okay. And they created a national healthcare service that was a wing of the German military. And that in a lot of ways, social democracy, Marxism, had become the social democratic movement. And social democracy was supposed to be a revolutionary movement to overthrow capitalism. But as capitalism moved toward this monopolistic stage of imperialism and finance capital dominating the world, socialism and Marxism as a movement simply turned into a mechanism for making that empire work more effectively. And that actually is what Karl Kautsky wrote about in his very important book. And he was an example of it himself. He sold out and supported the war. But before he did that, he compared the rise of revisionism and social reformism. He compared it to the way the Roman Empire distorted Christianity. The Roman Empire had originally fought and suppressed Christianity as a movement that opposed them. But as the Roman Empire was declining, they adopted their own watered down version of Christianity to try and save their empire. And Karl Kautsky observed in the 1800s and the early 1910s that as the Western imperialist system was entering more and more frequent crises, they began adopting their own version of socialism to try and save their empire. And that's the same thing that is happening right now. You're exactly right, Chris H. Zoran Mamdani and Bernie Sanders and AOC, they are the Pharisees. They are the synagogue of Satan, right? They are the false teachers, right? That as the imperialist system is dying, instead, they've tried to suppress revolutionary movements against it, but now they've invented their own version of it, their own watered down version of it to try and save their empire. So you're exactly right. Just like the Romans made a fake Christianity to try and save their empire, the imperialists made a fake socialism to save their system, right? Instead of making a system, instead of having a revolutionary movement that would overthrow them, they made a socialism that would make their empire work more effectively. And that's what revisionism is. And when Lenin emerged during the Russian Revolution, he was furious. The Bolsheviks were against World War I, and they opposed World War I. And not only did they oppose World War I, but they made war against the war makers, and they got money from the Germans. And Lenin came back to Russia on a sealed train from Switzerland, and they overthrew the government in order to end Russia's involvement in World War I. Peace, land, and bread. And they made war against the war makers. And Bolshevism, the Bolshevik interpretation of Marxism, was a completely new interpretation of Marxism. It said that nationalism among colonized and oppressed people can be a good thing. It didn't reject all nationalism as Marx did. Marx said only workers of the world unite. Well, Lenin said actually nationalism of the oppressed can be a good thing. And Lenin came up with this theory of imperialism. He said capitalism has moved toward a new stage of imperialism, and socialism won't come into the world as a result of the worker in the Western country struggling against his employer. It'll come into the world as a result of colonized and oppressed nations struggling against the imperialists and the rule of the big monopolies and the Western monopolies, right? And where did they have their revolution? They had it in Russia, a civilization of the land. And as soon as they had their revolution, they announced they would support anybody who would fight against the British Empire. And they backed the Emir of Afghanistan, and they backed the Egyptian merchants. And they said, anyone who fights against imperialism is our friend. They organized the Congress of the Peoples of the East. And they said, we are going to build a global movement against colonialism and imperialism. And that's what the Bolshevik movement was. And it's because of the Bolshevik Revolution that you got the Chinese Revolution of 1949. It's because of the Bolshevik Revolution that you got the revolutions on the African continent with Gaddafi and with Kwame Nkrumah. It's because of the Bolshevik Revolution you got Fidel Castro. It's because of the Bolshevik Revolution you got, the Ba'athist movement in the Middle East, Saddam Hussein. It's because of the Bolshevik Revolution that you got Bashar Assad. It's because and the Syrian Ba'ath movement. It's because of the Bolshevik Revolution that the anti-colonial struggles, Vietnam, all over the world, there have been anti-colonial revolutionary movements, and they all got impetus, and they were all given birth by the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, which happened because it was a break with regular traditional Marxism. It was saying that we don't want a Western Marxism, a Marxism that fits in with the British Empire way of doing things, a Marxism that is focused on making the Western system better. We're going to change Marxism to make it a movement of the colonized people against imperialism. And who didn't agree with that? Trotsky. Leon Trotsky was a leader of the Bolsheviks who said that, no, we should focus on Europe. It's all about Europe. His theory of permanent revolution said you could not build socialism in an impoverished, backward country. That when you have a revolution in an impoverished, backward country, it can only function as a mechanism to spread socialism to the West, that the peasantry is an inherently backward class. Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution was rejected, and the triumph of Stalin over Trotsky was very much a repudiation of European Atlanticist Marxism. And it was an assertion of a Marxism of the land. Marxism divided. There is Marxism of the sea, Marxism of the West, Marxism of the imperialist, globalist world, and there is Marxism of the land, Marxism of the civilizations of the land, of the colonized people resisting the imperialists. There are two Marxisms. There's the Marxism of your college professor. There's the Marxism of Bernie Sanders. There's the Marxism of every Trotskyite anarchist puke. And there's the Marxism of Stalin. There's the Marxism of Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping and Ho Chi Minh. There's the Marxism of the colonized people asserting their right. There's the Marxism of Amilcar Cabral. There's the Marxism of Kwame Nkrumah. There's the socialism of Gaddafi. There's the socialism of Hugo Chavez and Fidel Castro. There is the socialism of the land and of the people of the land. And there is the destructive, pessimistic, Western, decadent, corrupt socialism of Zoran Mamdani and Bernie Sanders and Ilhan Omar and all of the other westernized, liberal, destructive elements. There are two socialisms. There is a socialism that is focused on building and construction, and there is a socialism that is focused on spreading global chaos around the world. There is the socialism of George Soros, and there is the socialism of Xi Jinping that are fundamentally opposite. And this is what people don't get. A lot of the people on the right, they think China is just the same as George Soros. Well, they couldn't be more wrong. George Soros wants to overthrow the Chinese government. They think that Stalin was just the same as the obnoxious woke kid on your college campus, and they couldn't be more wrong. And in fact, we have confirmation of this from the very lips of Trotsky. Right? And Trotsky himself told us what he did not like about Stalin. This is what Trotsky wrote a biography of Stalin. It's on the shelf behind me. But in it, he opens by making clear, this is an actual quote from Leon Trotsky from his book on Stalin, quote, Leonid Krasin, old revolutionist, eminent engineer, brilliant Soviet diplomat, and above all, intelligent human being, was the first, if I'm not mistaken, to call Stalin Asiatic. In saying that, he had in mind no problematic racial attributes, but rather the blending of grit, shrewdness, and cruelty, which has been considered characteristic of the statesmen of Asia. Bukharin subsequently simplified the appellation, calling Stalin Genghis Khan, manifestly in order to draw attention to his cruelty, and which had developed into brutality. This is called racism, folks. This is called racism. Trotsky saw Stalin as not sufficiently European. Trotsky saw Stalin as Asiatic, as a civilization of the land. Trotsky said New York City was the foundry where the fate of mankind will be forged. That's what he said. And Stalin, on the other hand, was from Georgia, and he was a man of the land. And Stalin built up the land. And this is the Ballad of Joe Stalin. I'm going to put on the Ballad of Joe Stalin. It's about all of the construction that Stalin did. Stalin turned the Soviet Union into a global superpower with the world's largest power plants, the world's largest steel industry. Stalin, in one generation, he made the Soviet Union an industrial superpower. This is the Ballad of Joe Stalin.
Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
So that last verse, Stalin is a mighty man, and he made a mighty plan. He harnessed nature to the plow to do the work of man. What is that? All other animals merely use their environment. Man, on the other hand, forces the environment to serve him. Stalin is an expression of man's drive to build. And that's the point. And I'll tell you a couple other things. First of all, I told you about my ancestor, Charles G. Finney, who built a movement of people of the land against civilizations of the sea and against slavery, right? And he built a movement, and he started a college, and that college was called Oberlin College. Well, I'm going to put on the screen one of the greatest graduates of Oberlin College. It's so wild. There's just so much synchronicity here tonight. I don't even know where to begin. At Oberlin College, they have a room named after a famous woman who attended their college. And at Oberlin College, to this day, you can go, and in the upstairs of the library, they have the Anna Louise Strong room. Anna Louise Strong was born in Nebraska, and she graduated from Oberlin College, the same college started by my ancestor. And she was an American who wrote books about the greatness of Stalin. And she wrote, "No voice today can be final about the Stalin era. Stalin is one of those who are judged by long history. What we know, at least, is that he set out in 1928 to build socialism in one country, a backward peasant land surrounded by a world of foes. And when he began, Russia was peasant, illiterate, and when he finished, it was the world's second industrial power. Twice over, he thus built it, once before the Hitler invasion and again upon the war's ruin. That stands to his credit forever. He engineered that job." And that's a woman from Nebraska who graduated from Oberlin College in Ohio. And she went to the Soviet Union. She wrote great books that I discovered when I was in high school about Stalin and his efforts to build the Soviet Union into a superpower. And I got to tell you, folks, it gets even wilder because there's a biography of Stalin called Young Stalin by Simon Sebag Montefiore. And in that biography, this is a passage from that biography, right? And it talks about Stalin and Trotsky not agreeing with each other before the Russian Revolution. Stalin went to seminary school. That's how he learned to read and write. He was from a poor village in Georgia, but he went to seminary school to be a priest. And at seminary school, he dropped out and he became a revolutionary. But this is what a biography of Stalin says. The workers listened reverently to this young preacher. And it was no coincidence that many of the revolutionaries were seminarists, and the workers, often pious ex-peasants. Trotsky, agitating in another city, remembered that many of the workers thought the movement resembled the early Christians and had to be taught that they should be atheists. So even as he was building an atheistic communist movement, Stalin sounded like a Christian. Stalin was Charles G. Finney. He was a messianic figure of the land who emerged from the soil to fight against the civilization of the sea. And as Russia was being exploited and ripped off by the British Empire and kept in underdevelopment, from the soil, from the heart of the country, from Georgia, emerged this young preacher. Right? I'm telling you, folks, this all makes sense. I've been trying to figure this out and make sense of this, but it all actually makes sense. It all makes sense. And that Stalin and Charles G. Finney and Bonnie Prince Charlie and Ibrahim Traoré, it's all part of the same struggle. There is the civilization of the land battling against the imperialism, the British Empire system of the sea, and this has been going on for a long time. And the Center for Political Innovation makes sense as part of all of this. But now I want to get you to the part that will help you really understand all of this, right? And I'm going to get you to the essential part. I'm going to get you to an important moment. I would say one of the most, if not the most important moments in the history of our organization, right? Maybe we'll have more important moments, right? We've only been around. We haven't even been around a whole decade yet. So maybe we'll have more important moments. But one of the most important moments in the history of our organization came on July 29th, 2022. And this is what happened.
They handcuffed me and my wife out here. They wanted me to sit on the curb while they were carrying this out. Something that I refused to do. They wanted my wife to sit on the curb out here, that she refused to do.
As I was coming out, this big old drone met me.
The only revolutionary organization that's done something here on the ground practically for African people is the one that's come under attack. Institution that offers a community radio station, a newspaper, a commercial kitchen, an Aquaba Hall rental space, and community office for our organizers. That was the building that has come under attack.
Yeah, breach, what do you need? Need one? I don't know. What's hold better than money? Don't take it.
We will build a movement of white people that says hands off the Uhuru movement.
They see in the African People's Socialist Party a vanguard for the struggle for the liberation of our people. They see that because not just what we do here in the United States, but because we had the temerity to do like Garvey, to do like Malcolm.
And that is why we absolutely condemn the horrendous FBI raids carried out against the African People's Socialist Party, the Uhuru House, and Chairman Omala. From that organization here today to show that we are not afraid, we are not intimidated, and that we offer nothing but unequivocal full support and solidarity to them while they're under attack. Please stand up, comrades. Come on the stage, please. Revolutionaries and civil rights activists as agents of Russia is one of the dirtiest tricks of the U.S. deep state. They called Martin Luther King Jr. a Soviet agent. They called the Nation of Islam foreign agents. And we are here today to say that black people have the right to organize, fight for their rights however they choose, and that the U.S. government has no right to call them Russian agents or repress them in any way. The FBI raids must now stop. Must stop immediately now. Stop the raids. We want to turn the podium, the microphone over to our guests. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. My name is Columbai Antoinette, and how I always start any speech that I ever do is with a chant. So I want to teach you, or maybe you already know it, join in, because this is just the meditation of my heart, even coming here, and why it would never be any kind of retreat. We would never surrender. We would never compromise. We will continue to move forward and build. Fist up! Fist up! Fist up! Fist up! Fist up! This is what fight back look like. So I just really want to start off by saying I really want to appreciate the organizers that put on this event, no matter what road you have took, small, big, or large, for making this gathering happen and reaching out to the Uhuru movement and seeing this unjust raid is your fight. That they came after us today, but who's next? Because this is an attack against the whole black community. We see this not just an attack against Chairman Omala Yeshitela, Akile Anai, Deputy Chair Ona Zane Yeshitela, Chairwoman Penny Hess, Jesse Knoll, and all of our comrades that were directly attacked from this raid. But this is an attack against all of us. That's how we see it. So I say, I want to slow down, because I have been traveling here from St. Louis, Missouri. And when Chairman told me, I'm sending you to Chicago and speak to a group of people, I went to y'all website. I said, Chairman, you sure me? You sure you want to send me?
Yeah. Yeah. Just days after they raided the Uhuru movement, we did the right thing. We knew what we had to do. It just seemed like common sense. As soon as those FBI raids happened and we found out they were accusing them of being agents of Russia, the day they happened, I called them on the phone and said, what can we do? How can we support you? And the reason I did that was because I'm an anti-imperialist and I support the African liberation movement and I support Russia and I support China and I support Iran and I support the people of the land struggling against the empires of the sea. And so we immediately offered our support and we had our event and we welcomed them as heroes to our event in Chicago. That's what we did. And, it was one of the biggest moments in CPI history, if it's not one of the biggest moments. And it was a defining moment in our history because I assumed All right. This is how naive I was. I'm learning. We're all in a process of learning. I assumed that every communist group in America would be lining up to support the Uhuru movement. And I was wrong. I was wrong. The communist groups in America did almost nothing to support the Uhuru movement. Almost nothing. Some of them put out a statement on their website. The Communist Party of the United States put an article on its website. Oh, that's great. But it got worse than that. Not only did many of the groups not support them, just put out a statement. Some of the groups actually condemned them. Hassan Piker called them a cult and supported the FBI raids against them. And don't you forget it. Now that he's getting some intimidation, we'll support him in the face of the attacks he's getting for his Cuba work or whatever. But don't forget that he didn't stand with the Uhuru movement. Vosh, right, who's this big internet socialist, he not only did he not support the Uhuru movement, he attacked CPI for supporting the Uhuru movement, right? These leftists, they didn't do anything to support the Uhuru movement. Nothing. And I couldn't believe it. And we stood alone. We stood alone as all the communist groups found ways to make excuses not to support the Uhuru movement. Yes, Tucker Carlson supported the Uhuru movement, and he supported them because of us, because at that conference, Tara Reid was a speaker, and Tara Reid is a friend of Tucker Carlson's, and he heard about it, and he covered it on Fox News. But Tucker Carlson has done far more to support the Uhuru movement than any communist group in America has. And that is absolutely outrageous. And when that happened, I was in kind of disbelief. We, CPI, we did everything we could, and we continue to do everything we can to support the Uhuru movement. And I'm going to talk more about that later in the stream. But it just seemed like common sense. Why wouldn't you support this group of black socialists who are being accused of being Russian agents for their speech, not for any crime? They didn't frame them for drugs. They didn't frame them for murder. They accused them of talking about Ukraine in a way that Joe Biden didn't like. And they tried to throw them in jail, and they dragged them into federal court. And we rallied in their defense, and all the socialist and communist groups did almost nothing to support them. Why? What in the world is going on? What in the world is going on? Well, we now know what the issue is. Folks, it all gets back to the same thing. It all gets back to the same stuff. Folks, Chairman O'Malley was a leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the 1960s. He was a leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was a civil rights activist group. And that organization decided to come out against Zionism. And when that happened, they got attacked. They got attacked and smeared as anti-Semitic. And when I was in the Workers' World Party that pretends to support the Uhuru movement, I remember when the Uhuru movement challenged Obama, and they called out Obama. And we were told, oh, the Uhuru movement is a cult. They're just a cult. It's just a crazy cult. What was going on there? And in fact, even now, right? You see Charles Barron, New York City Council member, state assemblyman, he supported them, but where are the communist groups? Why won't they do anything for Uhuru? Because they're a movement of people of the land. Where are their two buildings? One's in St. Petersburg, Florida, and the other is in St. Louis, Missouri. And they're building a movement of the people of the land. And the so-called, what they call the white left, hates their guts. Hates them and calls them a cult and demonizes them. Why? Because they're against Zionism, and they're really against Zionism. And that's what this all really gets down to, right? There's a lot of people now that it's trendy to march for Palestine. People like Brian Becker, right? People like Hassan Piker, people like that say, oh, yeah, we're against Israel. We're totally against Israel. But they're not really against Israel. They're not really against Israel because they don't support Iran. And Iran and the Houthis and Hezbollah and the Shia axis of resistance, that's who's really opposing Israel. So if you really oppose Israel, you would support the axis of resistance. They don't. They find excuses to repeat CNN propaganda against the axis of resistance. But even more than that, what is the argument that the Zionists use for creating Israel? What is the argument? What is the Zionist belief? The Zionist belief is that Jews are the greatest people ever. They're just the superior group. And everywhere they go, they get persecuted. They get persecuted because they're just so much better than everybody else. And they have to have their own state because they're just so much better than everybody else. And that the people of Europe, of European countries, the people of Germany and France and Britain and America, deep down are a bunch of anti-Semitic, bloodthirsty haters, and that they've got to be opposed. And that's what Zionism is based on. It is based on hatred for the peoples of Europe, and a belief that the peoples of Europe are inherently anti-Semitic and that Jews are inherently superior to them, and they can never fit in Europe, so they have to have their own state. Now, that belief system, Zionism, Christian Zionism, predates Jewish Zionism. And it was invented by the British Empire. And the British Empire found a Jewish guy named Theodore Herzl to promote that idea among the Jewish people. And the Jewish people largely rejected it. Most of the Jewish people were socialists and communists who rejected Zionism. It wasn't until the Holocaust, when millions of Jews were killed, that Zionism got the upper hand. Zionism was based in Britain. Theodore Herzl, who was funded by the Rothschilds, the wealthy oil banking elite family in Britain, they funded Theodore Herzl. And after the Holocaust, Zionism got a big boost. But Zionism was a minority current. And the only reason that Zionism took off was because Theodore Herzl was funded by the British Empire to promote this idea. But what does the British Empire also promote? Malthusianism, the idea that there are too many people in the world. So think about it. There's one ideology that says the people that are not Jewish are just inherently backward and dangerous and evil, and they're evil. And there's another ideology that says the people are the problem and we need to drive down the population. Are you starting to see how they line up? One ideology says that we need to drive down the population and that most people, we just got to get rid of people because people are the problem. To save the world economy, we need to drive down the population. And another ideology says one group of people is good, but they're like a really tiny percentage of the human population. And all the other ones deep down are barbarians and animals and inherently bloodthirsty, bigoted anti-Semites. You can see how this kind of lines up. And that the British Empire that was promoting Malthusianism also are the people that created Zionism. And that Zionism was a project of the Rothschilds, and it was the Balfour Declaration that led to the creation of Jewish settlements in Palestine. It was the British Empire, the Malthusian British Empire, that brought us Zionism, and the Malthusian British Empire that is pushing the idea that there are too many people in the world. And I want to tell you a story. The Uhuru movement they trace their heritage, and they are very, very proud to trace their heritage back to a great man, a great leader of Black people and African people named Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey. And this is Marcus Garvey, kind of the founder of Black nationalism, right? And Marcus Garvey was thrown in federal prison and went to prison in America and eventually was deported back to Jamaica. He was a Black man in America who built the Back to Africa movement, it was called. Marcus Garvey is kind of the father of Black nationalism in America, and he built the Back to Africa movement. Marcus Garvey, let me put his image on here if it'll ever catch up with me. Marcus Garvey, here we go. Marcus Garvey, right, is the father of Black nationalism, right? And when Marcus Garvey was sent to federal prison, who did he blame for it? Zionists. And you go and read what he said at his trial. He said the Zionists were very happy to champion the rights of Black people and use the Black movement for their own ends. But when he asserted his independence and wouldn't follow their orders, they threw him in prison. Marcus Garvey had been very friendly to Jewish people and had many Jewish friends and backers. But when he was thrown in prison, he pointed out that the crime that they threw him in jail for was not something that he did. They blamed him for being complicit in something done by a Jewish businessman who had worked with him. And the judge who presided over his trial and didn't let him adequately defend himself was Jewish. And the prosecutor who prosecuted him was Jewish. And in fact, the jury didn't want to imprison him, but there were two Jewish jurors on the jury who held out and sent him to prison. And he just said, as somebody who really, had been very friendly and made many, many pro-Jewish statements, he was not anti-Semitic. Marcus Garvey pointed out when he was being railroaded to federal prison, he said, I am being railroaded to federal prison by Zionists. I'm being railroaded to federal prison by wealthy Jewish folks. That's who's doing this to me. That's what he said. And the Uhuru movement, they were part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and they came out in support of the Palestinians. And all these wealthy foundations that had been funding the civil rights movement stopped funding the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee because they said it's anti-Semitic to support the Palestinians. And I'm telling you, right, if you promote a socialism that is about creating instability and chaos, right, you can say you're against Israel and all of that. But if you are building a movement of people of the land, a movement of people of the land, you're building a movement of people of the land, that's what you're doing. And if you're building a movement of people of the land, they're going to call you anti-Semitic. They can smell it on you. If you're building an optimistic and progressive movement, the Zionists know what that is. They're fine with chaos and instability. They're fine with resentment and rage and hate. But if you're building a movement to bring people together and assert their humanity, they'll tell you Stalin was anti-Semitic. Stalin saved millions of Jews from the gas chambers. But yet they tell you Stalin was anti-Semitic. Why? Why was Stalin anti-Semitic? How could anyone think Stalin was anti-Semitic? But I guess it's just a fact. Why do they say that? One of my coworkers, when I worked at an insurance company in New York City, told me Martin Luther King Jr. was anti-Semitic. I said, why is Martin Luther King Jr. anti-Semitic? How is Martin Luther King Jr. anti-Semitic? He said, well, he's fighting for his people. He's fighting for his people. And that whenever any race is fighting for its people, it means to kill the Jews, right? And this is very, very interesting. And this brings me to another point, right? So this is J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI. This is something he wrote. FBI memorandum, August 25th, 1967. We must prevent the rise of a black messiah who could unify, electrify the black militant nationalist movement. Malcolm X might have been such a messiah. He is a martyr of the movement today. Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, and Elijah Muhammad all aspire to this position. That's the director of the FBI said they must prevent the rise of a messiah. Messiah. That's an interesting word, isn't it? The word messiah, an interesting word. What does the word messiah literally mean? What does it mean? Right? Generally Christians, we associate messiah with Jesus, right? Messiah is Jesus. But the word has a literal definition. The term Messiah translates literally to the anointed one. It originates from the Hebrew word Mashiach, referring to the ancient practice of anointing someone with oil to consecrate them for a divine or royal purpose. The Greek translation of the word is Christos, which is where we get the name Christ. Right? That's what it means. Right? It means anointed one. One who is anointed, right? That's what the word means. Very, very interesting. But yet the FBI said its official purpose was to prevent the rise of a messiah. Interesting. Prevent the rise of a black messiah. That was what they did. And we know what the FBI did. We know about the murder of Fred Hampton. We know about the questions people raise and all the details and the lawsuits surrounding the death of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And that the FBI was saying we need to prevent the rise of a messiah. Very interesting. Very, very, very interesting. And this word messiah, right, is a word of Hebrew origin. It just means the anointed one. But if you think about it, the word messiah, has got some interesting implications now, doesn't it? For example, right, if you view Christians as inherently anti-Semitic, right? Christians are inherently anti-Semitic. If Christianity, I was told by one of my coworkers, all religions except for Judaism, especially Christianity, are just an excuse to kill the Jews, right? If Christianity is just an excuse to kill the Jews, I guess the founder of Christianity, Jesus, who is considered by Christians to be the Messiah, would be a bit of a problem now, wouldn't he? Now, wouldn't he be a little bit of a problem? Also, right, and this is very interesting, why is it that Orthodox Jews don't support Israel, right? Why is it that Orthodox Jews don't support Israel? There's a very heroic minority, a very small but heroic minority of Orthodox Jews, right, who don't support Israel. Why? I'm going to show you a clip of one of them, right? This is a short clip. I caught an argument between an Orthodox Jew who is opposed to Israel and a Zionist Jew. And this is an argument that they had. I'm going to show it. It's 1 minute, 26 seconds. It was a great moment. It was so awesome that we were able to catch this on film, right? You know, it was just a great moment I wanted to show to everyone. But this is an Orthodox Jew debating a Zionist Jew and explaining why he doesn't support Israel.
The Sabbath, which is paramount to anything. Yes, sir, Rabbi?
It's Zionist propaganda who is responsible for 77 years of bloodshed. Zionist like he is responsible for 77 years of bloodshed. The rivers of bloodshed on account of Zionists. We lived in peace prior to the movement of Zionism.
That's not true, because I come from the Middle East, my friend. That's not true.
In 1929.
That's not true. 1929, my grandfather got thrown out of Hebron in 1929.
Rabbi Baruch Kaplan in 1929, he was at the Hebron massacre. He gave a speech that the Zionist was responsible for this bloodshed at Hebron massacre.
Oh, thank you. That's like a husband. That's like when Ike Turner used to beat up Tina Turner and says it's hurting me more than it hurt her.
It's Rabbi Baruch Kaplan, who was the founder of the Beis Yankov schools all around the world. He spoke at a speech that the Zionists are responsible for this
mythology. The Jews lived in harmony with Arabs. When Arabs are under the Jewish rule there.
It's a fact. In Iran, till today, the Jews live there in peace.
You think they're not scared shitless to live in Iran?
Till today,
they don't open their mouths. They can't talk. They live in peace.
I was at the synagogue in Iran.
We
visited the synagogues in Iran, not he. He believed the Zionist propaganda.
You know what? Let him go speak to Iranian Jews.
We visited.
Let him go speak to Iranian Jews.
This is what we did. This is what we did.
A Jew in Iran can't speak freely and say how things are.
This is what we did.
That's not true.
We went to the synagogues in Iran. They live peace. They practice their religion. They are protected by the government. There is no bloodshed there. There's no bloodshed there.
Yeah, that debate is very, very interesting. And when it really gets down to it, though, if you talk to a Hasidic Jew, one of the Hasidic Jews who's against Israel, they'll tell you why they oppose Israel. Well, the theological reason. Obviously, they have moral outrage about what Israel's doing. But one of the big things is that it is a belief of the Jewish religion that Jews cannot have a state until it is created by the Messiah. Only the Messiah, the anointed one, can create a Jewish state. And that's why some Orthodox Jews that support Israel won't call it Israel. They call it Eretz d'Israel, meaning land of Israel, but they won't call it actual Israel because only the Messiah can create it. And some of the Orthodox Jews that support Israel still won't serve in the military because they believe you can't have a Jewish state until the Messiah creates it. They won't call it actually Israel. They've explained, well, it's like a landing pad. When the Messiah comes, he'll come there. It's like it's the land of Israel. We're like creating. It's not actually Israel. That only the Messiah can create Israel. And that's why Orthodox Jews don't support Israel to some degree or other. You know, a lot of them make excuses. Some of them won't call it Israel. Some of them won't serve in the military. And then you have a very heroic minority, Neturei Karta, that is absolutely against Israel. Only the Messiah can create Israel. So if you're a Zionist, Messiah is got to be the biggest thing that is a threat to your narrative, because your very religion says that only the Messiah can create Israel. And so any notion of people talking about a Messiah There's got to be a big threat to your entire narrative, because there can't be an Israel until the Messiah shows up. And your entire religion says you can't have a state until the Messiah shows up. So any notion of a Messiah is raising alarm bells and forcing people to ask questions about your belief. This is where it all gets very, very interesting. We had J. Edgar Hoover talking about getting rid of a Messiah that could unify the militant black nationalist movement. We have all of this. So then, folks, I just want to let you know, CPI, we've been on an interesting journey. We've been on a very, very, very interesting journey, right? And, from the moment CPI was formed, certain people saw us and just, they saw red. They just hated us. I couldn't understand the hatred that people had for us. It made no sense to me. But it was like from the moment we came into existence, I don't know what it was. We waved American flags. American flags are evil and racist. No matter what we did, people just hated us. They just hated us with a passion. But we kept going. We kept going. And we refused to follow the rules. We called ourselves communists for a long time. And now we've kind of moved on from that, because we are doing something new and exciting. But we called ourselves communists, but we had the understanding that we wanted to do like Stalin. We wanted a pro-growth, anti-imperialist, anti-colonial socialism, a socialism that wasn't about creating chaos and tearing things down, but about loving our community, loving our country, wanting to oppose globalism and imperialism and build things up. And you're not allowed to do that. And just that vibe just made people so angry, right? And it was just a fact. He's a white nationalist. He's a white supremacist. I'm not a white nationalist. Before I moved to New York City, I was videotaping police brutality acts and getting young black women acquitted in federal court. But I guess it just became a fact. I mean, I'm married to a non-white person, but it just became a fact that I was a white nationalist. I'm definitely not a white nationalist, but I must be a white nationalist because I don't want to destroy America, because I wave an American flag, because my movement is not, the movement that I'm building is not based on chaos and instability and sowing resentment. There were some weird things that happened. Yes, I was opposing police brutality long before Black Lives Matter. You can read the article about me in Cleveland Scene magazine. I was on the local news for my anti-police brutality activism, but it's just a fact. He's a white nationalist. What was going on? So after we stood with Uhuru, right, the attacks on me really escalated. And there was one person, I want to show this clip. So people that have been around the internet and looking at communist stuff on the internet a long time, unfortunately, have encountered a guy named Jason Unruhe. He used to call himself Maoist Rebel News. I was Jason's biggest defender. People were always insulting him and making fun of him. And I said to people, look, I said, he's doing it and you're not. He's got a big audience. More people are listening to him and his YouTube channel than any communist group. And it was true at that time. He had a big YouTube following. He had an audience on YouTube, and more people were watching his videos than were watching anything any communist group was doing. And I defended him. And I used to go on his YouTube channel and do interviews. And he was anti-imperialist. He defended North Korea. He defended Libya. I liked him. And, he always had a problem, which was he didn't understand that we need a movement. And he had this very pessimistic worldview that there is no hope. And then out of the blue, he just started hating me. And the problem with him is you could inbox him anything and he would believe it. And people were telling him I was trying to frame him for child pornography, which I wasn't doing. And people were just telling him all kinds of stuff. And he just decided I must be a fascist. I was an awful person. So we had a debate. And the debate, I look back on it now, it was a complete waste of time. It got a lot of views. Everybody loves watching people fight. Everyone loves it. But it wasn't productive. And I kept trying to make it about politics. And I kept reading him quotes from Mao and saying, let's talk about where we actually disagree. He wanted the debate to be about, you're bad. And it was one of those really unproductive debates. It was him saying that, oh, well, you said this and what that means, and it was a dishonest debate. It was, I don't like you, so I'm going to try and twist your words into making you a bad person. Not a productive debate. People should debate about what they actually disagree about. And the question that if I debate him or anybody else ever again, I'm going to begin the debate by saying, what do you want the audience to learn from this debate? Because if I had said that to him at the beginning of the debate, and I was kind of hinting at that by pulling up quotes from Mao and asking him, he just kept saying, he didn't want the audience to learn. He just wanted the audience to learn that I'm bad. I'm bad. You're bad. But we had the debate. And there's one moment from the debate that really perplexed me. It just completely perplexed me. It took me completely by surprise. So we had published, and it's still out there, we have a book called Jesus is a Socialist. And it's a book that, it's got verses from the Bible criticizing capitalism, and it's got quotes from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. opposing capitalism. And it talks about how Christianity and socialism can overlap. And in my debate with Jason Unruhe, he brought that up as if it was like an awful thing I had done to put out this book, Jesus is a Socialist. Like, how dare I? And this is the moment in the debate where he decided, he brought that up. And watch this. This is bizarre. I apologize if this is going to be triggering for some people, but this is Jason's response to me putting out the book, Jesus is a Socialist. March 26th, 2022, called Caleb Maupin's Racist Pandering. And at 5 minutes and 3 seconds into the video, you referred to this book, Jesus is a Socialist, that I published. And you claimed that in this book, I advocate a theocracy, and that I say that, people that people are commanded by God to follow me. Can you tell me what page that's on? I've got the book right here. So
no, it's not specific wording. It's in the substance of what's being said.
So is it all the quotes from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? Is that where you got that from?
Now, can I answer that, or do I have to?
No, go ahead, please. I'm curious where in this book I ever.
Okay, cool. Now I'm going to answer. The substance and what you were trying to do, because what it is that you're trying to do is that Jesus would want you to be a socialist, which I find problematic considering that you would first have to show any evidence that he actually existed, but that's besides the point. And because you have crowned yourself the savior by, say, the CPI.
How did I do that?
I will explain exactly how you're doing that. Only the CPI can save us. I'm trying to answer. Could you please mute yourself? Seriously, mute yourself. To answer your question before you interrupted me again, like the hypocrite that you are, because you have posed yourself as only the CPI can save us and only the CPI's line is correct. Yes, that's why you started the party, and that's why you attack literally everybody else. Nope. Okay, Center for Political Innovation and Organization, whatever it is that you want to call it.
We have members of the Communist Party in our group.
That's what you're doing. You're appealing to people, telling them that, oh, I want God. Or pardon me, God would want you to do what I'm doing, and I'm telling you it, so therefore you follow me. This is very similar to how a reverend or a priest acts. That's what I mean. And I love the obnoxious faces. That was exactly like Bosch did.
Are you done?
It's strange that you're just acting like him. Yeah.
Okay. Well, you're using a very common logical fallacy called telescoping, where you're saying, well, you said this, and this means this, and this means this, and this means this, and this means this, so therefore... And that's not the case. First things first, CPI is not a party. There are people in many different political organizations that are members of the CPI. I've never claimed that I'm the savior, that CPI is the one true way. And in fact, the whole reason we started it as a think tank rather than a party is to get out of that kind of childish LARPing and actually try and have an institution that can push Marxist politics in a way people can understand it. CPI is not a Christian organization. I would say the majority of the group are atheists. We have some Muslim members. We have some Jewish members. And I'm in the minority as someone in the group who's a Christian. And in fact, the very first book we published was a Muslim socialist book by Gaddafi. This pushes Islamic socialism. So the very first book we published was not a Christian book, was explicitly a Muslim book. So the notion that we put a book of quotations from the Bible and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Eugene Debs and Daniel DeLeon and others out there in order to make the case that we're trying to establish some kind of Christian theocracy is simply poppycock. I mean, it just doesn't add up. I mean, do you disagree with that?
To answer your question, it's not telescoping because I'm not making a series of things. I'm taking the collective whole of what's being said.
Well, the collective whole of what's being said is we put out an Islamic socialist book.
Yeah. By the way, publishing somebody else's work doesn't really count as publishing a book.
And I mean, we published Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in here. The majority of our organization are not Christian. And? So I'm
and yet you keep, unless, but again, yes. when I made the criticism, You were at the time pushing the whole Christian socialist thing.
So what? And there are Muslims in our group who
that's
push the Muslim
how it's
socialist
relevant.
thing. And there are
to that
atheists in our group who push the.
No, and you're not letting me answer.
I mean, and how do you get from that I think I'm the savior? Because I quote the Bible and make the case that if you're
okay,
a Christian,
can I answer
you
that?
shouldn't support capitalism.
Oh, okay,
how
so
in the world
you're not going to let
do
me
you get
answer
from that?
Okay.
How in the world do you get from that I think I'm the savior?
Because the way you've positioned yourself within the organization, not to mention as well as the fact, as was adequately demonstrated by Yankee Tanky, the amount of whatever Maupin says is true, whatever Maupin does is right. And there's no room for anyone to disagree with you.
There's plenty
so
of room
you
for
have
people to
set
disagree
yourself
with me.
up in that way.
Yeah, well, that's just utterly false. And
no,
you know,
that's
I don't
not
think,
false.
Yes, it is.
I'm sorry. Does he have a grudge to pick about something else? Is he lying?
Who?
Yankee Tanky. You remember he was the person who left your organization and came out against you?
First of all, most of what was put out there was personal grievances he had with another member, which I'm not even going to address in this venue, which aren't really relevant. And second of all, a number of his videos have been removed, which is probably an indicator that he no longer wants that out in the public sphere and no longer stands by such comments. So I'm not going to indulge Yankee.
Or you threatened him.
No, I didn't.
I don't know that you did, but I wouldn't put it past you.
You just said I threatened somebody, and now
I said, or you threatened him.
Or okay, all right. Wow, this is really, really great. So based on the fact that I talk as a Christian socialist and I put out this book after publishing a Muslim book, after publishing a number of other writings in a majority non-Christian organization, you, based on that, claim that I believe to myself to be the savior, right?
No,
you're
you
calling
don't believe
me
you're
some kind of like insane, I believe you used the term cult, all based on the fact that I put together a book of the writings of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Do you think that other people watching might think that's a little nuts?
No, because the way you've positioned it is that if you disagree with you disagree with Jesus.
No.
Yes, that's literally the
Jesus
whole point of it.
Existed in thousands of years ago. I'm using this book to make a point that the idea, which is widely believed in among normal people in the United States, that Christianity and Marxism are complete opposites. This is wrong. And that if you're a Christian, you can be a socialist. And in fact, there's many things in the Christian teaching that overlap with socialism. I think it's important that we put books out this. Yeah. And I mean, it was beyond me. I mean, I publish a book that's got quotations from the Bible criticizing greed and capitalism and man's inhumanity to man. And got quotes from Dr. Martin Luther King. And immediately he goes to, you think you're the savior. You think you're the Messiah. You're starting a cult. And I'm just like flabbergasted. Like, where do these people, I mean, it's odd. But yet, right, this is the underlying fear, right? That they wanted to prevent the rise of a black Messiah. Messiah is this thing that they're obsessively talking about, right? And even Stalin, right? Stalin's crime was that he was Asiatic and that he was this dynamic preacher who was, didn't teach people that they should be atheists. And that I'm telling you, all of this is starting to make sense, right? And that I'm figuring all of this out as I go, right? I mean, there are things, I know a lot about economics. I know a lot about world history. I know a lot about psychology, but I'm learning. And we're all learning together. And I've been honest with you all. I know I don't know everything, but I'm starting to put all of this together. And I'm starting to figure this out, which is that when civilizations of the land are besieged and overtaken by empires of the sea, from the soil of the land, there emerge figures who lead the people to fight for their liberation. And sometimes they succeed and sometimes they fail. And that is in my blood. That is in my heritage. That's what I come out of. I'm descended from a figure who emerged from the soil to fight the empires of the sea and build an anti-slavery movement. And that I am naturally attracted to such movements, right? And that's my background and that's my origin story. And there are a lot of weird synchronicities, right? The fact that Charles G. Finney, he fled New York and moved to Ohio because he was against slavery. And I fled Ohio because the economy was crumbling and I couldn't survive there. And the party moved me to New York. And I ended up, running from the police just blocks away from where Charles G. Finney's church was in New York City. And that my claim to fame was Occupy Wall Street. And that it was just blocks away from where this church that my ancestor set up was. And that, my ancestor was involved in a struggle to defeat slavery, and slavery was a product of the British Empire system. And that the socialist movement is dominated by crypto-Zionists who are not interested, and their greatest fear is some kind of, movement of the people of the land, and they hate Stalin, and they think that I'm anti-Semitic, and there's a lot of synchronicities here. But it really just gets back to this. If you want to understand what it's all about, it really just gets back to this, that Americans have within them the ability to fight to be a people of the land and a civilization of the land. Right now, our country is rotting and deteriorating from within because we are part of imperialism. And because of that, the people of the land, the American people who believe in growth and believe in economic growth in their bones, are angry. And from among the soil of America and from among the American people, a movement is going to emerge to demand that we become a civilization of the land, to assert our right to grow and build and struggle, to assert our right to have a society that enables human beings to grow and to create and struggle. And that based on my background and based on my heritage and based on the values that I learned from my uncle and from my grandfather, and based on who I am an expression of geopolitical forces that are bigger than myself. And that to some degree or other, I have taken on and become an expression in my life, has been an expression of values and societal forces and spiritual conflicts that are bigger than me. And that I am trying to build a movement for a people of the land to fight back against imperialism. And that's what the Center for Political Innovation really is. We are a movement of people of the land, demanding a government of action that fight for working families, demanding a society where human beings are allowed to grow, repelling the empires of the sea, repelling globalism and imperialism, demanding that America join the multipolar world, and that we build and we construct and we don't have a destructive society, and that we promote optimism and growth, and that we invest in human beings as the source of all labor power, and that we stand in solidarity with people like the Uhuru movement that are trying to do the same thing in their own community. And that the Zionists can smell us. They can smell us, and they immediately accuse us of being messianic figures, right? That's what they're calling. They're calling us Christians. Basically, they say there's something Christian about your movement. There's something Christian about your movement. We don't like it. We want movements about rage and vengeance. We want movements about instability. We want movements we can use to spread chaos all over the world. But you sound like Stalin. You sound Asiatic. You're not an empire of the sea. You're not the kind of socialism we like that's about rage and tear things down. You're building a socialism about optimism. You sound like that Asiatic Stalin. You sound like that Ibrahim Traoré, who we think is a dictator, who we spread propaganda against in Jacobin. You sound like Chairman O'Malley, who is anti-Semitic as he's building a movement among African people, not promoting Israel like the civil rights movement that we gave money to. You sound like some kind of messianic movement that's making people feel optimistic and hopeful. I bet you think you're the savior. I bet you're trying to set up a Christian theocracy. You want to kill the Jews. That's what you want to do, Caleb. You want to kill all the Jews, right? That's what you want. Well, I don't want to kill any Jews. I don't have anything against anybody. But I am against Zionism, and I'm against globalism and imperialism. And I want a country where people come before profits and human creativity is unleashed. And I reject the empire of the sea. I reject the satanic international order that is bombing and destroying people all over the world and kept Africa in poverty and kept Latin America in poverty and is backing Israel and is at war with the Islamic Republic of Iran and has murdered Palestinians. I reject that satanic international order. And I'm not going to reject it in the name of hateful rage and resentment. I'm going to reject it in the name of hope. I believe in humanity. I believe that human beings are beautiful creatures that are capable of building and constructing. And I don't accept their perception that human beings are just another animal. And I don't accept their claim that there's too many people in the world and we need to drive down the population. And I don't accept their notion that we can only maintain a biological existence. I maintain that human beings are special and hopeful, and that every child who's born has something beautiful to give to the world, and that we should unleash human creativity and brilliance. And what Stalin did, turning Russia into a superpower, and what Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping did, making China the second largest economy in the world, and what the great African leader Ibrahim Traoré is now doing on the African continent. All of this points to the fact that human beings can break out of the cage of this irrational economic system, and we can grow and produce and expand, and we can have a life that is beautiful for all mankind. And yes, I maintain that we can overcome a system where abundance creates poverty, and that human beings can transcend, and we can build a world with a beautiful life for everyone, and that we can march forward and we can build a beautiful world, and that we don't have to accept the artificial restraints that keep them at the top. That's what I believe. I don't think that's anti-Semitism. I don't think that's hate. I don't think that's racism. I don't think that's fascism. But they do. They do because it is the antithesis of their system. It's pro-humanity and pro-growth, and they are anti-humanity and they are anti-growth. And the only way the British Empire system can stay intact, and the only way Wall Street and London can stay at the top of the world, is to try and shove humanity back into the bottle, to put us into a mere biological existence, to try and reduce us to being hogs and sheep. Well, humans are not hogs and sheep. Human beings are creative. We build, we construct, we expand, and we need an optimistic movement that brings out the best in people, that organizes the economy rationally so that growth is unlimited, that helps people learn to love and forgive each other, that builds community and understanding, that helps people find their strengths and their achievements, that invests in communities, that invests in the next generation of youth and doesn't invest in wars and prisons and bombs and opioids. That's what I strive for. We need a government of action that fights for working families. We need to build an anti-monopoly coalition to break the power of Wall Street and London. We need a government of action that fights for working families. That's what we need in America. We need to end these wars, and we need America to join arm in arm with the people of the world in the rising new economy that is possible if human beings can assert their will against the forces of darkness that have seized power in this world. The colonial system, the British Empire system, is doomed, and humanity is going to rise. We're building a movement that is about that. We make friends with people that are building a movement that is about that. And those who might espouse ideas similar to us, they can always smell us in our words and our actions. They can smell when we're doing something different, right? Just like the crypto-Zionists became Trotskyites and eventually became neocons, the people that were attracted to communism because they wanted rebellion and instability and chaos, and they couldn't stand Stalin because he was building and constructing, right? Just like the criminal cartel that controls communist groups in America and has made them into a stupid college phase people grow out of, right? It's kind of a cult of destruction and instability that you eventually grow out of, right? I mean, they can smell us, right? The forces of evil can smell us, and they know what we are, and they are honest with us. They think we sound like Christians. They think we sound messianic. They think that we are optimistic and hopeful, and we are not espousing all the negativity that is the package that comes with leftist politics. And we look up to people like Russian President Vladimir Putin, who rescued his country from the nightmare of the fall of the Soviet Union. We look up to Xi Jinping in China and what he's doing with the Chinese dream. We look up to the Houthis and Ansar Allah as they rally their people against the Zionists. We look up to Ibrahim Traoré and the amazing things he's doing on the African continent. We are what they are afraid of. And our socialism is not a socialism they can use to create culture wars and tribalism and instability. Our socialism has the potential to defeat their system. And we put out an optimistic, hopeful message, and we can actually do it. And that's what scares them. That's what scares them. We are people of the land, and our movement is much bigger than any book I ever read or any idea I ever had. This movement's way bigger than anything I ever understood. It's way bigger than any values I learned from my uncle or my grandfather or inherited from my ancestor, Charles G. Finney. It's way bigger than all of us. We are people of the land, and we are fighting back. And America will be a civilization of the land. So dare to struggle, dare to win. God gave the land to the people.
And the land, the ground on which we stand. Why should we be beggars with our ballot in our hands? God gave the land to the people. Sound the blast of freedom, boys, and send it far and wide. March along to victory for God.